Hi, welcome to Mr. Otter Studio. Today we are going to be painting watercolor koi fish, and we are going to be using koi watercolors, and we are also going to be using the wet and wet technique as well as the glazing technique. So this is a really good practice to learn those two different techniques as well as learn how to paint without having a drawing on the paper first. We will practice painting the fish together, practice painting the water together, and then we will paint the water and glaze the fish on top of the water. We're going to be using these koi watercolors, and these come in tubes and they come in different sizes. So these are the 5 milliliters, these are the 12 milliliters, these are the 24 packs, and these are the 12 packs. Here's a close-up so you can see the difference between the 5 milliliter and the 12 milliliter tube. These are the supplies that you need. You need 2 pieces of watercolor paper, one to practice on and one for your final painting. You need your watercolors, and again, I'm just using this combination of red, yellow, and blue. So Carmine, Cerulean blue, and deep yellow. And since we're using tube watercolors, we need to have a mixing tray or a mixing palette to use with them. You can also just use a plate. If you just have a glass plate, that works great. You need paint brushes, and I'm just going to be using a number 10 round and a 3/4 inch flat. You will need a container with water in it to paint with, and a rag or a paper towel. And that's it, let's get started. If you're right-handed, you can set it up like I have with all of my supplies on the right side, my water kind of the furthest away. And if you're left-handed, just flip this to the other side. So we're gonna be doing some practices first. So you wanna just grab your first piece of paper, and we're going to be doing a wet and wet technique for the water. Okay, so the first thing we wanna do is make a big blue puddle. The nice thing with these tube watercolors is you can make a puddle really fast, and you don't need very much paint. More water to make it more transparent, or less water to make it more opaque. I'm going to mix up a lot because I'm going to be using it to practice with, and then we might as well just use this puddle for our final painting. And since this is a practice piece of paper, feel free to try out your color on there. Mine's really light. You might want it to be a little bit darker. It's totally up to you. Somewhere on your paper, we're going to paint just a square of color, and then quickly we're going to drop some more of that color into it and make the color of the ripples or the water, just to add some texture and movement in the water. I'm going to put a little bit more of my cerulean blue right up here in the corner, and I might use that for my darker areas that I'm putting wet and wet. You're going to just dip your brush in that paint, and I'm going to give you a tip for making a flat wash. You can kind of tilt your paper up, so watch. Just paint a square on there, and you can see as I'm painting, do you see the watercolor kind of pooling up at the bottom? Then I'm just slightly overlapping it and painting down into the area that I'm trying to cover. It has to be wet for this to work, so hurry and just mix up a little bit more blue up in this corner, and then we're just gonna drop it in. And you can make like a circle and not go all the way out, kind of break up the lines. You could do 1, you could do 2. I just like to make the lines kind of broken just a little bit. It almost looks like maybe a raindrop hit the water or something like that. Okay, now while that's doing its thing, let's go ahead and paint some koi fish. And as you can see in this little video, there are so many different kinds and colors, and their fins look so different, but we're going to be kind of painting a wispy finned koi fish, and we're gonna paint them with yellow and then add some of the red into it. So I'm just grabbing some deep yellow. I'm gonna put it in my tray, just a little dot. Sometimes I like to paint them even a little bit orange. If you want to paint it a little bit more orange instead of yellow, just add a teeny bit of red, and I'm just using Carmine, but I'm going to put some over here. So we need some yellow and some red, whichever colors you're using. You don't need to use the same yellow and red that I'm using. So we need like a medium-sized puddle for our orange. So we don't want to have to stop and mix, and we want it to be wet, because just like we did a wet and wet technique for the water, we're going to be using a wet and wet technique for the koi fish. So let's go ahead and mix up that color. So let's just see what color this is on our paper. So that's pretty light, so we might need a little bit more color in it. I don't want it to be quite so transparent. I need it to be a little bit brighter since we're gonna be layering it over blue. So that's a little bit more color. Now I want a little bit more red. The nice thing with tube colors is you can always add it. You just can't take it away. So start with less, and then you can always add more. Okay, so I like this color. So the first step is just painting the body of the koi fish, and then we'll add the fins, and then we'll add some wet and wet colors to kind of add some texture and interest to our fish. Make sure you have enough color on your paintbrush. And again, feel free to test it on your testing paper. And then we're just gonna paint an oval. And you can make, like this will be the head of the fish. You can make it a little flatter at the top if you want, but it's gonna be a little bit bigger, and then it's going to come into a tail. So we're just gonna bring it together a little bit. So a long kind of stretched oval, and then we're going to paint these back fins first. And you're just going to paint 1 and then 2 and just kind of lift your brush off the paper, and that's how you can get these nice pointy edges. You could add some whiskers. Do it. And then let's go ahead and add these big fins and then some smaller back fins here. And you don't just have to add 2. Some of them I saw are kind of like tattered and they have all sorts of cool edges. This is a little bit short, but that's okay. And then I'm going to dip into my red, and I'm just going to add a few little details. So it's wet and wet, so I'm just going to add like some dots. And you could stop wherever you want. You don't have to add as much as I am. This is a practice anyway. But I do like to add a line in the middle for like that top fin. And then I do like to bring a little bit of a line around the edges to kind of separate it from the fins. You can also, if the fins are wet, feel free to bring some of the red onto the fins. Okay, let's try another fish, and this time let's paint it so that it's kind of curving. So it's not swimming straight, but it's curving. And this one, I would say the body is too short. Should probably be a lot longer. It would be helpful, definitely, to look at some koi fish while you're painting this. So let's start with the head. Let's have this one curving in that direction. So we're painting our oval, but I'm kind of pulling it a little bit in this direction. And then I'm just think of how the water might move these fins as this fish is swimming and turning. Go ahead and do the same thing. Go ahead and add a little bit of your red. And then again, I like to add just that line on the top, indicating that there's a fin on the very top of it. Let's paint another fish, and let's just do this one kind of curving. It's swimming in this direction. I'm not making it quite as wide. And to get it thicker right here, I'm just kind of pushing down a little bit and then pulling away. When you stretch it out, I feel like it looks a little bit more realistic, like a koi fish. Maybe these are just baby koi fish, I don't know. So add the red in there, and if you don't want it to be as dark, you can dilute it with some water. We're going to paint our background and let it dry, and while it's drying, we're going to practice painting some fish on this area on our practice paper. So grab your final paper, and you can paint this however you want. You could paint like a square on your paper. You could maybe have edges that look like water kind of splashing out, kind of like these edges right here if you want. It's totally up to you. But I highly recommend starting from the top and moving to the bottom. Let the watercolor kind of run down the page so it makes a nice flat color. And we have to do this kind of fast because in order for wet and wet to work, the paint still needs to be wet when we're adding those accent colors for the splashes and the movement of the water. So the nice thing is we have this huge puddle mixed up already, so this shouldn't be too hard. And I'm just going to make a really loose edge. I don't want it to be super straight. So again, just paint in that area that you want to use for your fish, and you can paint 1 or 2 on here. It's totally up to you. You can even let drips of water like run down your paper, which I think would look so cool. I'm just doing like a rectangular shape, but I'm not going to go all the way down to the bottom of my paper, so it's about that big. And it's still wet. Now grab your smaller brush, rinse it out. I'm going to get a little bit more color on my brush because I have a puddle of color right there. And then I'm just going to try to make those little splashing areas where there's like a little bit of movement in the water. As they get further away from the middle, I like to make them a little bit further away from each other, but this doesn't have to be like mathematic. They don't have to be exact. It's just to add a little bit of movement. After you've painted some of the movement in the water with the wet and wet technique, we're just going to set this aside, let it dry, and let's practice painting a fish in our puddle right here. So we're going to glaze a fish on top of our water. Just like we did before, we're going to start with the body. I might paint this one going down in this direction. This is going to need to be kind of small. So add some accents in there. So now let's just wait for our puddle to dry. You can practice a few more koi fish, and then we will paint our final ones on the paper. And you might want to just practice like a composition. You know, do you want like to have some movement going in there? Do you want them to be meeting in the middle, like swimming away? So think about movement in your painting. You get to choose this composition. You don't need to paint this exactly how I am. You really should use your skills to paint it how you want it to be. Once your blue puddle is dry, and you can see if it's dry by looking at it, make sure it's not shiny. I'm just reactivating my orange puddle here. You could add a little bit more yellow if you want. You still have your scratch paper handy, so you can test it out and see if it's the color that you like. So hopefully you had time to kind of think about how you want to paint these fish. If you want to paint 1, if you want to paint 2, So I'm gonna paint one swimming this way and maybe one swimming that way. And it's totally up to you how you choose to do this, how big your fish are, what they look like. And you could add like those little whiskers that koi fish have if you want. The key with glazing, which is what we're doing right now, painting one color over a dry color, is you want to be careful not to scrub your paper and move your paintbrush all around, or it'll start to lift up and reactivate that bottom color, and that's not what we want to do. Branch off and paint those fins in. And remember to use those fins as a way to show the movement of that fish, like how it's kind of floating through the water. After you get your fins on there, then you can add your red accents. So this is wet and wet. So we want to make sure we're doing this while it's still wet or it won't really work. It will work, it just won't bleed as much and kind of have that cool, just watercolor effect. And remember the fin in the middle. So I usually just kind of paint a line indicating that. You can definitely paint onto these fins as well. Mine have just already started to dry. So I'm just gonna kind of leave this one as it is. And then my next one, I wanna paint it a little bit more orange. I'm gonna mix a little bit more red in with my puddle and just use my scratch piece of paper to look at that color. And let's go ahead and paint our second fish in. If you're painting a second fish, and you can kind of choose, and they can overlap, where it is, how it's going to be swimming, if it's bigger or smaller than that one. Okay, so then I'm grabbing that other color. It's a little just a bit more red. I'm adding some details. Sometimes I like to go around the edges just to kind of separate the fins from the body and make it look like the body's coming up and that the fins are flat. So let it dry, and then I like to just kind of cut my paper down to match the shape that I've painted for the koi fish. I hope you learned how to paint a koi fish and also how to glaze with watercolor and how to use the wet and wet technique. Thank you so much for painting with me, and I hope you have a wonderful day.